Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Virtual Poly 130. This lecture, we're going to be talking about ethnic conflict in Yugoslavia. But before we get into another harrowing episode of ethnic conflict, let's get into some housekeeping. So again, your paper topics have been released, and remember that they are due on April 13th. This is a different system that we usually go through because usually your papers are due and assignments in general are due on a Wednesday, but this is a Monday. So write down that date. Make sure that you turn them in on your section website on April 13th. And don't be late. Also, your reflection paper topics have been posted in an announcement on Sakai. So if you intended to do a reflection paper for this week, be sure to check out those prompts that you can respond to and turn your assignment in by the time that your TA required. Um, and remember that you have to do either a reflection, if your TA allows a discussion question, or one of those reading guides before the semester is done with in order to get full participation points for the rest of the semester. Okay, those are the only housekeeping items thus far. So let's get into the guiding questions for today. Again, we're going to talk about how ethnicity becomes mobilized into conflict or violence, but this time we're going to look at it in the specific case of Yugoslavia. So to understand kind of what's going on in Yugoslavia, we're going to ask ourselves what ethnic relations even look like in Yugoslavia, what kind of state are we dealing with, and then we're going to try to explain ethnic violence in the cases of mainly Croatia and Bosnia, but Serbia is also involved in the conflict. So we're going to try to explain what caused ethnic violence in these three cases. So recall from last class, we asked ourselves the question of how ethnicity became mobilized into conflict or violence, and we had three theories to deal with that. So the primordialist theory sees ethnic violence as a result of kind of ancient hatreds that are latent and always exist between different ethnic groups. Instrumentalism sees violence as the work of ethnic entrepreneurs who specifically use ethnicity in order to achieve other gains, whether they be political, economic, or otherwise. So they manipulate people's ethnicity to try to get them to mobilize around it and possibly be violent around it. The institutional perspective looks at the role that institutions in society, whether they be political or social, have in making ethnicity salient to people and making it something that people might want to mobilize around for violence. And to that, to those three perspectives, we're going to add one more for the purposes of this lecture, which is fear. We talked about fear a little bit when we were talking about Rwanda, but we're going to expound on that more in this class in particular. One of your pieces, I believe that the Oberschall piece, really talked about what we call an ethnic security dilemma. So we're going to talk about that. So in the fear perspective, ethnic conflict arises out of fear of action by opposing groups. So on one side, there's ethnicity A, and they are afraid that ethnicity B is going to mobilize around their ethnicity, perhaps become violent around it. And so they begin to mobilize themselves. And so ethnic conflict then is a consequence of a security dilemma. Now, a security dilemma, if you've taken Poly 150, you probably know about this term, but it is a way of describing how people interpret others' actions and how they begin to defend themselves around it. So we can consider a security dilemma beginning with the fundamental condition of anarchy. So anarchy might mean that there's no reasonable leader, that the state has become weak in some way, but there's not enough concrete and solid leadership for people to feel like, you know, their basic interests are being secured. So when there's anarchy, say we have two ethnic groups, A and B, A will begin to develop a fear of B because it cannot be protected by the state from B. And in order to protect itself, it might develop defensive capabilities. So perhaps, in the most trite kind of form, perhaps they build like a wall or a fence, but they also might begin to arm themselves, right, buy things like guns in order to defend themselves. The problem is that looking from the outside, you can't tell if a gun is being purchased to defend oneself or if a gun is being purchased to actually launch an attack on another group. So then B is likely to interpret A's militarization as offensive, right? That, oh my gosh, they're buying up all of these weapons. They're doing it so that they will be able to attack us in the future. When that happens, B will then develop its own defensive capabilities, right? It's going to try and buy guns of its own in order to be able to defend itself against any possible attack from A. That confirms A's fears of B, and leads it to develop more defensive capabilities, right? Because it thinks, oh my gosh, B is in fact going to attack us. And the kind of unintended consequence of all of this militarization is that you get war, right? Eventually, somebody is going to use one of those guns to shoot because their fear has become entirely too high. And so it's a situation very similar to what we saw in terms of building up capabilities in the nuclear war, that people were building up all of these defensive capabilities. And in episodes like the Bay of Pigs, it almost came to the brink of war because both sides had kind of misinterpreted what the other side's militarization was about. And so, in an ethnic security dilemma, these things tend to be exacerbated by the lack of cross-ethnic linkages. So remember in the Varshni piece, they said when ethnic groups kind of interact with each other regularly, we can squash these rumors, right? We can understand that, oh, they're just doing this as a form of defense, they're not planning it to attack us, etc. So when there are cross-ethnic linkages, we tend to not get these security dilemmas. And when the state tends to be neutral, right? When the state doesn't step in, when there is no state or the state doesn't step in to kind of tamp down these fears, then we also tend to exacerbate the security dilemma. Okay, so we're going to add this to our repertoire, and we're going to look at these 4 theories as a way of understanding ethnic violence in Yugoslavia in this lecture. But before we get to an analysis of the ethnic conflict itself, it's important to understand what did kind of ethnic relations look like in the former Yugoslavia. Just to give you a preview of kind of what happened in Yugoslavia. It was a country that consolidated, let's say in 1947, was relatively peaceful from 1947 all the way until the 1990s. But in 1991, we saw the outbreak of conflict. There was a civil war in Croatia that lasted about 4 years, from 1991 to 1995. And then there was another civil war in Bosnia and a massive genocide in Bosnia from 1992 to 1995. So we did, in fact, see the case of Yugoslavia degenerate into violence, which makes it a really interesting case to look at as far as why did this happen, right? There's a great test case for our 4 theories. So what was the nature of ethnic relations in Yugoslavia prior to violence? Well, another reason why this is a very interesting case to look at is perhaps more so than the case of Rwanda. Yugoslavia actually was a true multi-ethnic and multinational state. Um, so the Balkans, which is kind of the region that comprises Yugoslavia, is one of actually the most diverse regions in Europe. It is characterized by a fair amount of religious diversity, particularly between Orthodox Christians, Catholics, and Muslims. So in general, the Yugoslavia, what was the former Yugoslavia, is about 50% Orthodox, most of those being concentrated in Serbia, Montenegro, and Macedonia, with various Orthodox populations in Bosnia. the Catholic dominated areas are Slovenia and Croatia, and then there are Muslim populations as a kind of after consequence of the Ottoman Empire's takeover in Bosnia and in Kosovo. So we have a pretty high amount of religious diversity. About 50% of the population are Orthodox, about 9% are Muslim, and around 20 or so percent are Catholic. There's also a high amount of linguistic diversity, so people actually speak different languages. They're all kind of a part of the same language family, but Serbian, Croatian, Slovenian, and Macedonian are totally different kind of dialects. And it's although people could probably understand one another, they are different languages. There's also a fair amount of ethnic diversity between Serbs, Croats, Muslims, etc. So obviously in Serbia, or the region that is known as Serbia, there are tons of Serbs. There are Slovenes in Slovenia, Croats in Croatia. There are also, like I said, in Bosnia, we see Muslims. Montenegrins are kind of a different ethnic population, Montenegrins, Macedonians. We also see ethnic Albanians in Kosovo. So there's a kind of a wide variety of different ethnicities. And in fact, there are distinct nation states in Yugoslavia. So the Yugoslavia is comprised in its what was contemporary times, or what were contemporary times in the 1940s. It was comprised of 4 federated states, and these used to be independent republics. So as we'll see, in the Kingdom of Yugoslavia, Croatia was its own republic, Slovenia its own republic, Serbia its own republic. So these are comprised of basically nation states that, for example, Slovenia comprises practically all Slovenes. Croatia has some combination of mostly Croats and some Serbs, etc. So all of this diversity combined to make people think that the Balkans in particular was going to be a hot pot of ethnic conflict, especially before the 1930s, or actually I guess in the 1910s, 1910 to 1920 or so. People thought that, there was going to be a lot of conflict in the Balkans, that it was kind of a hot pot for tension and violence. And in fact, in 1918, it was the actions of a Serbian militant that set off the events of 1914. Excuse me, 1914, it was the acts of a Serbian militant that set off the events of World War I, right? So a Serbian militant assassinates Archduke Franz Ferdinand, and that is how we get kind of the spiral of events that lead us to World War I. So there is some reason to believe that this place would be a source of ethnic violence and ethnic tension. However, it's important to note that for most of the history of Yugoslavia, it was a relatively peaceful state, right? In the period of the Kingdom of Yugoslavia, we had different kingdoms united together, right? There were formerly independent republics that were then united. They were ruled by a highly centralized Serbian dynasty. And although there was some latent power struggle between Serbs and Croats under this dynasty, there wasn't a lot of move towards ethno-nationalism. In fact, in 1929, the government officially banned kind of ethno-nationalism by making regions not based on the ethnicity that lived there. So this used to be, for example, Slovenia. This used to be the Kingdom of Croatia, but naming them instead after rivers and major waterways, right, in order to break up some of that ethno-nationalism. So in general, in the kind of early period of the Kingdom of Yugoslavia, throughout the post-war period, post-World War I period, we didn't have that much ethnic conflict and ethnic violence in the Kingdom of Yugoslavia. Now, this all changes in World War II particularly as we get the Axis takeover of Yugoslavia. So Hitler and the rest of the Axis powers come in and they take over Yugoslavia. And they do a couple of things that actually changes the nature of ethnic relations in Yugoslavia. On the one hand, they redivide the territory along national lines. So recall that before we did have independent kingdoms or independent states for different ethnicities, and they reinstated that policy. So right now we have, again, we'll have a Serbian kind of kingdom, we'll have an independent state of Croatia, one for Montenegrins, et cetera, et cetera. The other thing that they do is they expand Croatian territory and recognize it as an independent state. So, whereas before Croatia was just kind of this blue area, somewhat small, now Croatia has extended into the former Republic of Bosnia and Herzegovina. And so now we have a big expansion of Croatian influence, right? And they have some autonomy in the ruling of their affairs. And that expansion comes somewhat at the expense of Serbians. So Croatia now comprises this entire land of Bosnia, which is partially filled with Serbians. And so that is an affront to Serbian power in the area. More than that, they empower Croatian separatist forces called the Ustazi, and they allow them to persecute Serbs that were formerly in their territory. So there are Serbs that are living here in certain parts of Croatia and Serbs that are living in Bosnia, and those under the Axis rule are basically allowed to be persecuted and kind of forcibly removed from those areas. And so what we see is the growth of this very brutal force called the Ustazi. And they go around doing things like chopping the heads off of Serbians, killing Serbians wholesale in their homes, and carrying these heads around town. And in fact, interestingly enough, the Nazi Party was reported to be shocked at the brutality of the Stasi force and how swiftly they tried to exterminate Serbs in their area. So in the from 1939 to 1945 is where we see the real explosion of ethnic violence that is allowed by the Axis powers and perpetrated by Croats against Serbs. Now, all of this comes to an end because World War II comes to an end, and we get the transition of Yugoslavia from an Axis-ruled territory to a communist territory. And in fact, during the communist period, we get the rise of a singular leader, Josip Tito, as the president of Yugoslavia. Now, Tito is a totalitarian leader, right? Very authoritarian in his stance. But he is kind of a magnetic feature, a magnetic leader in terms of how he shifts the kind of conversation and the perception of ethnic tension in Yugoslavia. So he does a couple of things to really diffuse any ethnic tensions in the area. First, he establishes Yugoslavia as a federated republic. So it's one whole country again, but they're independent states. So Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia, Serbia, Montenegro, and Macedonia are all independent states, much like the states of the United States, whereas Vojvodina and Kosovo are autonomous republics. And all of this is kind of held together in the singular Yugoslavian state. He explicitly suppresses nationalist rhetoric and replaces it with a communist and socialist ideology that is meant to unite the country as one. So on the one hand, like I said, Yugoslavia then becomes one singular kind of territory with its own symbols and nationhood, but also a slogan starts to emerge, Bratstvo and Jedinstvo, which basically translates to brotherhood and unity, right? So he actually gives a speech at some point, which he says, you know, we're not Serbians, we're not Croats, we're not Macedonians, we are Yugoslavians, right? And so he tries to promote this idea of unity. There are also administrative reforms to balance the ethnic tensions that could exist in society. So, on the one hand, they create a presidium, so a federated presidency. Although Tito is at the top, there are also representatives from each of the autonomous republics in equal number. So they are allowed to engage in some type of limited power sharing in the executive. And he also decentralizes a lot of political power to the republics, right? So that states can kind of rule themselves, and he creates these autonomous republics to allow states to basically choose their own policies, whether those be economic or political. And this leads to a lot of good things for Yugoslavia. On the one hand, GDP per capita really increases during this socialist communist period. So we see a high increase in economic growth from 1947 to 1988. And also ethnic relations tend to be pretty calm during the time. Any really instances, there were a couple of instances of ethno-nationalism in the 1970s with the Croat Spring, but those are immediately tamped down by the authoritarian state. They send in the military. They basically arrest any type of militants. They try to stamp it out really quickly. And so you might ask yourself, okay, well, then how did we get from this peaceable situation to the civil war and genocide that I mentioned earlier? Well, if there's one person holding your society together, right, that's great, except for the fact that death comes for us all. And that is exactly what happened. Tito died in 1980. And that set off a sequence of events that led to crisis and that led to violence in Yugoslavia. So once Tito dies in 1980, the first thing that we get is a political vacuum, right? Remember that even though there's this kind of presidium, right, this federated presidency, Tito is sitting at the top of it, and he's exercising most of the political power. Once he dies, what we get is a default back to the formal system in place, which is a rotating presidency, right? So every 5 years, a president could come from each of the different republics, so from Serbia, Montenegro, Croatia, Slovenia, etc. And there was also in the power sharing element, there was a possibility of veto on both presidency, like presidential candidates, and on legislation. So if there was a majority within the federated republics, right, to, for example, say no to a particular presidential choice, then that could happen. And so what this creates is a bit of weakness at the center, right? There's not a strong figure anymore to rule the state. And so there's political competition that increases among these different republics in Yugoslavia. It's kind of hard to tell them apart because the flags are so similar, but they're actually somewhat different. The colors are reversed in some of them. So these are, in fact, different republics. Another thing that happens is that there's a huge economic crisis, and that's in part because of Tito's death, but also in part because there was a lot of foreign aid that was flowing to Yugoslavia in the 1980s. But with the fall of communism in 1989, the foreign aid basically dries up. And so what we see is kind of economic development fall off a cliff in 1989. And we see kind of the basic fall in people's standards of living over that time. Now, one interesting thing about this is that reduction in standards of living was actually not spread evenly across Yugoslavia. Recall that I said that economic relations were also decentralized. So each republic could decide what types of policies it wanted to implement. And what that led to was a huge divergence in how well any given region was doing economically. So while Croatia and Slovenia were responsible for most of the economic growth in Yugoslavia, other areas like Kosovo and Bosnia were not doing that well, right? Had very low levels of GDP per capita. And interestingly enough, those places were the sites of huge ethnic conflict, in part due to these economic grievances that existed in the area. A third thing that happened is that once Tito died, and once his kind of rhetoric about repressing nationalism and kind of solidifying a Yugoslavian identity went away, we saw the strengthening of various nationalistic tendencies. So in places like Kosovo, where again, the economy was doing extremely poorly, what we saw was ethnic tensions rise between Kosovar Albanians and Kosovar Serbs, with Serbs blaming Kosovar Albanians for a lot of the economic deterioration, and for the general repression of Serbian identity in Kosovo. And so we saw episodes of violence break out between these two groups. We also saw in 1985 the Serbian Academy of Arts and Sciences release a memorandum that was highly critical of Croats. Engaged in various hate speech towards Croats and ethnic Albanians, promoting basically this idea of Serbian supremacy and Serbian nationality. What we see is like kind of the foundations of conflict being stirred up in these areas. And this is further exacerbated by the actions of individual politicians. So Slobodan Milosevic, a name that you might be familiar with, is really influential in this process. He was the president of Serbia, and actually next in line in kind of 1988-89 to become president of the Republic of Yugoslavia. And he was sent by the current prime minister to reduce ethnic tensions as kind of as an envoy to reduce ethnic tensions in Kosovo. So he's set to give a speech that's supposed to kind of calm down things that are happening in Kosovo. But what he sees is a political opportunity for himself, a way to gain more power for himself within Serbia and within kind of the federated Yugoslavian Republic. And when conflict begins to break out at this rally between ethnic Albanians and ethnic Serbs, what he instead does is gives a kind of virulent speech that says no one should says to the Serbs, that is, no one should dare to beat you again. And so what that speech does is it recalls the Ustashi violence that happened in World War II, recalls the historical persecution of Serbs, and kind of riles up pro-Serbian tensions and nationalism in the area. And Slobodan Milosevic will be known for having done that, not only in the Kosovar area, but also in Croatia and Bosnia. And then the last thing that this actually leads to is, with all this strengthening of nationalism and with the economic differences between regions, there's actually countries move to become independent. And usually this happens first with the richer countries. So in the early 1990s, there are referendums held in Slovenia and Croatia to become independent republics. And this is kind of a consequence, again, of the economic crisis, right? It's kind of like when Greece was failing in the EU, and certain wealthy EU states did not want to keep, supporting Greece in their failure, so they kind of wanted to withdraw from the EU. It's a similar process here, that Slovenia and Croatia felt like they were being economically crippled by staying within the federated Yugoslavian republics, and so they held a referendum in order to become independent. Now, Slovenia basically achieves its independence somewhat peacefully. There's a 10-day war between Slovenia and Serbia, but in general, Serbia is willing to let Slovenia go. But what it is not willing to do is let Croatia go, or Bosnia go, which is another state that wanted to become independent. And so what we ultimately get is a civil war and a genocide a civil war in Croatia and a genocide in Bosnia around these kind of ethnic tensions. So in Croatia, we get a war that lasts 4 years, from 1991 to 1995. An estimated about 20,000 people die in this war, so not a terribly high death count. But the war is generally sparked by, again, the decision by Croatia to become independent and their declaration of independence, but also the fears of Serbian communities living in the Krajina. So, like I said, Slovenia got off pretty easy because there are no Serbs in Slovenia. It's mainly a state of completely Slovenes, and so the government in Yugoslavia, which was led by a Serb, Slobodan Milosevic, was fine to let Slovenia, kind of go its separate way. But in Croatia, there are Serbian communities. There are, uh, predominantly Serbian communities in these red kind of highlighted areas in Croatia. And Serbians felt like if Croatia was to become independent, there was a possibility that these groups would be repressed or discriminated against, and they wouldn't have any recourse. They'd be separated from actual Serbia, which is down here, by the state of Bosnia. And so Serbia, the other Serbs in Serbia, could not come and help to protect these what would be then isolated Serbian populations in Croatia. So there was a real fear that repression against Serbs would increase in an independent Croatia. Um, and that was in part fueled by the fact that nationalists, so Croatian ethno-nationalists, had come to power in Serbia as well. And then eventually, even though this crisis lasts for 5 years, it is ended by a joint UN and NATO intervention. So after kind of seeing the death toll rise in this area, the UN sponsors a peacekeeping force and NATO engages in air raids to kind of remove Serbs from the Croatian territory to support Croatian independence. And eventually we get an independent Croatian state in the 1990s. Now in Bosnia, the conflict is actually more severe. Remember that one of the problems with Bosnia is that it's between Croatia. Croatia would be here and Serbia would be here. And one of the reasons it kind of became ensconced in all this conflict is because you have Serbian populations in Croatia that exist about here. For Serbs to actually get to them, they would have to go through Bosnia. And that helped to spark ethnic tensions in Bosnia, which is a highly multi-ethnic state. So Bosnia is comprised of Serbs, those areas are indicated in blue, of Muslims, which their areas are indicated in green, and of Croatian areas, which are indicated in orange. And so kind of ethnic tensions between these three groups led to a civil war and a genocide that lasted over the course of 3 years from 1992 to 1995. Again, violence in this case was sparked by independence and the fears of Serbs living in Bosnia. So even though Serbs are clearly the dominant population in Bosnia, there were fears that once Bosnia became independent, that those Serbs would be distant, especially as the Serbs living here, would be too far away from the Serbs in Serbia to be able to protect themselves effectively. And when Bosnia actually did have its own referendum for independence, those fears were stoked even more. And so what we got, again, is the rise of ethno-nationalism, Serbian armies kind of coming into Bosnia to protect Serbs. And then in response, we got Croatian and Muslim militias rising up to protect their populations, etc. Overall, there were about 100,000 deaths in this and over the course of this civil war, and some of that was sparked by the genocide of Bosniak Croats and Muslims by Serbs. So, in one particular event in Srebrenica, about 8,000 Muslim male youths were killed, were slaughtered, basically, and buried in a mass grave. And that was just a consequence of the Yugoslavian army and the Serbian army in Bosnia coming in and trying to exterminate wholesale Muslim communities in order to limit their influence and basically create a territory that they could effectively annex as a part of Serbia. And again, this conflict is ended by NATO intervention. So particularly given that the US and others did not pay enough attention to the Rwandan genocide, they explicitly decide not to wait in Bosnia and to intervene on behalf of Croats and Muslims in the area. And eventually you get the conflict ending as a part of the Dayton Accords, and some power sharing agreement coming between Serbs living in Bosnia and Croats and Muslims living in Bosnia, such that there are two kind of federated republics here in Bosnia. On the left-hand side, we have the Republic of Bosnia and Herzegovina and Republika Srpska, on the right-hand side. So how do we explain ethnic violence in this case? Well, there are a lot of different ways we can look at it. One, on the ethnic hatred side, on the kind of the primordialist side, I think we have a better case in Yugoslavia than we did in Rwanda. So again, Yugoslavia is actually ethnically diverse, right? Whereas in Rwanda, we might say that these ethnic differences aren't legitimate, right? They aren't really real. Rwandans speak the same language. They look relatively similar, etc. Here we actually do have distinct languages, distinct religions, and distinctive ethnic communities. So there might be something there. Also, we have a history of ethnic violence between the two, right? There's clearly violence that broke out between Croats and Serbs during World War II, limited violence between Croats and Serbs in the 1970s, between Kosovar Albanians and ethnic Serbs in the 1980s and 90s. So there is some evidence that there actually might be underlying tensions between these two groups. However, we needn't take this too far, because remember that ethnic relations were generally harmonious pre-Tito. So in general, about 36% of people in workplaces suggested that interethnic relations were very friendly. Over 50% thought that they were at least friendly, if not very friendly. Intermarriage rates were around 12 to 13% between ethnic communities. As a point of comparison, the current intermarriage rate in the United States is about 15%. And in surveys given, and these are mentioned in the Oberschall piece, there wasn't really a lot of support for violence, nor did people actually think that Yugoslavia would break up. So even though there was some actual concrete evidence of different ethnicities and perhaps ethnic tensions between groups, I don't think we should overblow that, because for a long time, there was ethnic harmony between these two groups. Perhaps a better explanation of ethnic violence in this case is the instrumental explanation. So looking at the roles of independent leaders at actually stoking potential ethnic violence between these two groups. And here we need look no further, although we will, than Slobodan Milosevic. As I mentioned in that famous 1987 speech in the Kosovo fields, he made sure to play upon histories of ethnic violence between Serbs and Croats in order to suggest that Serbs were being persecuted by ethnic Albanians in Kosovo. There was also a lot of top-down rhetoric from groups like the Serbian Academy of Arts and Sciences to kind of stoke tensions between these two groups. In Kosovo in particular, pro-Serbian groups were releasing false statistics about the number of Serbians that were raped by ethnic Albanians and the level of crime that existed between the two. Even though those rates were very low, they were saying that they were high, and that ethnic Albanians were kind of getting off scot-free with these crimes. And this didn't just apply to Serbs, right? In Serbia, in Croatia, especially in the 1989 elections. So the the elections post the communist breakup, what we saw is nationalists generally rise to power in a lot of different republics. So in Croatia, we see the rise of the HDC party and Franjo Tuđman, who is a pro-Croatian nationalist and begins to spread kind of pro-Croat rhetoric. And in Bosnia, we see the rise of Milan Rajic, who is a Serbian, but is then spreading pro-Serbian rhetoric in Bosnia as well. So we see the rise of these nationalist parties that then spread this rhetoric down, kind of trickle it down to populations. And I would say that this is exacerbated by our third explanation of fear. Politicians were able to basically promote ethnic conflict and ethnic tension so easily because they played upon the fears of citizens about being persecuted in their ethnic community. So again, going back to Slobodan Milosevic, remember that he used the memory of Serbian persecution in World War II in order to rile up Serbian populations. And this is attested to by various, commentators on the Yugoslavian conflict. So Bogdan Denic says that everyone was traumatized by all the talk of World War II atrocities, even those who had seemed immune to nationalism. Old personal ties and friendships crumbled, as well as friends and family members rallied to the defense of their own nation. The pressure to do so was immense. And that pressure only increased as we saw actual state militias coming around and trying to exterminate populations, right? So even though we had a situation of relative ethnic harmony beforehand, as we see, the growth of politicians talking about ethnic tension, recalling these memories of persecution, and armies actually moving through towns, we see these harmonious ethnic relationships between individuals deteriorate over time. And I have in section, or rather in lieu of section this week, you'll be watching a really cool documentary that shows you how this happened, right? How these fears were played upon and how they actually affected ethnic relations at the community level in Bosnia. And just as a note, these fears were exacerbated because these communities were often separated. They were these ethnic enclaves. So in Croatia, for example, there are small Serbian communities surrounded by Croatians, right? So that exacerbates fears because you're thinking, oh my gosh, there's no one to help defend me. I'm kind of surrounded by enemy forces. And in Bosnia, like I said, even though Serbs were the dominant population, there were certain areas where they were cut off from other Serbs, kind of heightening these tensions and fears. The final explanation that we have is institutionalism. And while I think that this is somewhat weak in Yugoslavia, there is some evidence that institutions could have played a role. On the one hand, a decentralized presidency created competition for power among the different federal presidents. And we saw that with Slobodan Milosevic. Like, one of the reasons he began to appeal to ethno-nationalism is because he wanted to create kind of a coalition around himself that would allow him to not only gain the presidency in Serbia, but eventually be able to be the president of Yugoslavia in general. Also, the decentralization that existed, as we saw, and the push for democratization in Serbia following the fall of the Communist Party created incentives for states to declare their independence. So because Croatia and Slovenia were doing so much better in contrast to the other republics, they actually had incentives to break away and create their own states, which kind of stoked ethnic fears and tensions. And then finally, that veto power that I mentioned actually helped to spur more ethnic conflict, because once Milosevic became president of Yugoslavia, he was able to abolish the autonomy status for Montenegro and Vojvodina, effectively making them Serbian republics. Because there was a Serbian in Bosnia, that meant that 4 out of the 8 republics, or 4 out of the 8 territories, were dominated by Serbs, and Serbs had an effective veto power over legislation that might come in through the Yugoslavian system. And in fact, they used that veto power to cancel the rotating presidency, basically to reject the Croatian president that was supposed to come after Milosevic, which kind of stoked, again, more ethnic tension between Serbs and Croats. So eventually that did kind of stoke a bit of ethnic violence in this case as well. Although I think that this is one of the lesser explanations. It's definitely not as strong as we saw in cases like Rwanda, or as we will see in a case like India. So again, I leave you with the food for thought of which explanation of violence do you personally find most convincing, having done the readings on the subject, if those were the ones that you did. So think about this question, mull over it for a bit. And then for next class, what we're going to do is I'm going to give a bonus lecture that you can watch. It's going to be short because we've kind of already talked about India, but we're going to give a bonus lecture giving you a different perspective on what might explain ethnic violence in India. And then, like I said, in lieu of section this week, you are probably being assigned to watch a really cool documentary on ethnic violence in Bosnia. And I really suggest that you watch it because it shows, perhaps better than I can in lecture, how the combination of kind of instrumentalism and fear work together to create ethnic tension and ethnic violence in a previously harmonious community in Bosnia. So I'll leave you with that. Obviously, next class, we're also going to move from ethnic violence to revolution. So I encourage you to do the readings. Again, in solidarity with you from our homes. I hope you guys are managing well. And I guess I'll see you next class. Talk to you later.